the sacred ground of being, a journey into the is that we are. Introduction, the questions that bind us. For millennia, humanity has stood at the threshold of existence, formulating questions that echo through the corridors of time. These questions, dressed in the robes of philosophy and religion, have shaped civilizations, ignited wars, and built temples that pierce the sky. Yet within this vast architecture of inquiry lies a paradox as ancient as consciousness itself. The very framework from which one asks a question determines the landscape of possible answers, and if the foundation is flawed, the entire edifice of understanding becomes a palace built upon sand. The seeker stands before the mystery and asks, "Is there a God? What is God? How may I know Him? How might I approach this distant, magnificent other?" These questions, repeated across centuries and cultures, have spawned libraries of theology, intricate systems of worship, and endless philosophical debates. Mountains of parchment and ink have been sacrificed to answer what seems the most fundamental of human inquiries. And yet, in the asking itself, in the very structure of these questions, lies a subtle error, a misalignment so profound that it colors all that follows with the hue of separation and exile. The error is this: to conceive of the divine as something, as an object among objects, however sublime, as a being among beings, however exalted, as a presence that exists outside the questioner, across some metaphysical chasm. In this conception, the seeker becomes forever separate from the sought, the lover perpetually distant from the beloved. All the philosophies built upon this foundation, all the religions constructed from this blueprint, all the spiritual practices designed to bridge this imagined gap, they become, in essence, attempts to cross a divide that never existed except in the architecture of thought itself. The idolatry of separation. What greater idolatry could there be than to cast the infinite outside the boundaries of one's own being? The ancient prohibitions against graven images spoke not merely of stone and wood, but of a deeper desecration, the reduction of that which is to an object of cognition, something that could be held at arm's length, examined, categorized, and filed away in the library of the known. When the mind creates an image of the divine as external, as other, it commits the fundamental act of fragmentation from which all suffering flows. Consider the nature of this misconception. Consciousness, small and uncertain, peers out from behind its veil of thoughts and sensations, seeking something beyond itself. It imagines a ladder of ascent, degrees of separation, veils to be penetrated. It creates elaborate maps of spiritual geography, heavens above, hells below, and the soul somewhere in between, climbing or falling according to its merit. The entire cosmology of separation unfolds from this single error in perception, this original fragmentation. Yet the truth whispers something entirely different, something that cannot be grasped by the seeking mind, but only realized in the quieting of that very seeking. The divine is not something. The absolute is not an object. God is not a being, however supreme, but being itself, the is that underlies, permeates, and transcends all that is, was, or ever shall be. The source is not distant, it is the very ground upon which the seeker stands, the light by which the seeker sees, the awareness within which all questions arise and dissolve. The is that we are. There exists a consciousness deeper than thought, more fundamental than sensation, more intimate than breath. It is the awareness of being itself, not the awareness of this or that particular thing, but the simple, luminous fact of existence. Before the mind labels, before thought divides the seamless whole into fragments of self and other, before language creates the illusion of separation, there is. This is not a concept but the living ground of all experience, the silent presence that witnesses the dance of phenomena while remaining forever unchanged. We are not separate from this is. We do not exist outside it, striving to reach it through discipline or devotion, through knowledge or renunciation. Rather, we exist within it, as expressions of it, as movements in its infinite stillness. The consciousness that looks out through these eyes, that knows itself as I am, is not other than the consciousness that dreams the cosmos into being. The wave is not separate from the ocean, the ray is not apart from the sun, the note is not distinct from the symphony. To recognize this truth is not to acquire new information, but to awaken from an ancient amnesia. It is to remember what was never truly forgotten, to return to what was never truly left. The spiritual journey, paradoxically, is the discovery that there is nowhere to go and nothing to become, for one already is that which one seeks. The treasure is not at the end of the path but beneath the very first step. The kingdom is not in some distant heaven but within, closer than breathing, nearer than thought. The path of inner experiencing. If the is cannot be known as an object, how then is it to be approached? Not through the accumulation of concepts, for concepts are of the mind and the mind traffics in divisions and categories. Not through elaborate rituals, though these may serve to quiet the surface turbulence of consciousness. Not through intellectual understanding alone, though understanding may clear away obstacles. The is approached, if such language may even be used, through the direct experiencing of is itself. This experiencing is unlike ordinary experience, which always involves a subject experiencing an object, a separation between the knower and the known. In the experiencing of is, this duality collapses. The one who experiences and that which is experienced are revealed as not two, as movements within a single field of being. It is less like learning something new and more like seeing clearly for the first time, like the lifting of a veil that was never truly there. The path to this experiencing requires not the accumulation of more but the release of that which obscures. Consciousness must be cleansed, not because it is impure, but because it is clouded with mental misinterpretations, with the endless commentary of thought, with the accumulated debris of psychological time. The mind, with its ceaseless activity of judging, comparing, remembering, anticipating, creates a veil between awareness and its own source. Like a mirror that cannot reflect clearly when covered in dust, consciousness cannot recognize its own nature when obscured by mental turbulence. What is required is a turning inward, a reorientation of attention from the external theater of phenomena to the inner ground of being. This is not an escape from the world but a discovery of what the world truly is, an appearance within consciousness, a dance of forms in the formless, a play of light in the luminous void. As attention withdraws from its fascination with objects and rests in its own nature, the is begins to reveal itself, not as something newly arrived, but as what has always been, the constant backdrop against which all change occurs. The revelation of silence. In the silence between thoughts, something vast opens. In the stillness beneath activity, an infinite depth reveals itself. When the mind's incessant narration pauses, even for a moment, the is shines forth in its naked simplicity. It is not dramatic. There are no thunderbolts or visions of celestial realms. It is more subtle than that, more fundamental, the simple recognition of being, the direct knowing of existence prior to all concepts about existence. This revelation cannot be forced. It comes as grace, as a gift that the separate self cannot claim as its achievement. Yet there is a preparation, a readiness that can be cultivated. The practices of contemplation, meditation, and self-inquiry are not means to manufacture the is, for it is always already present, but ways of removing the obstacles to its recognition. They are like the polishing of a mirror, not to create the mirror's reflective nature, but to allow it to function according to its inherent capacity. In this state of clear seeing, the old questions dissolve. Is there a God? Becomes meaningless, for the questioner realizes their own being as not separate from the divine ground. What is God? Transforms into the direct knowing of isness itself. How do I approach him? Is revealed as the ultimate paradox. How can one approach what one has never left? The questions that seemed so urgent, that generated libraries of speculation and centuries of debate, are seen as arising from the dream of separation, and in the awakening, they simply fall away. The logical ground of being. There is a logic here, though it transcends the formal logic of the thinking mind. It is the logic of direct insight, of seeing that requires no proof because it is self-evident to the one who sees. Consider, the perception that begins from a small, isolated consciousness looking out at a vast alien universe is inherently unstable. It generates anxiety, for the self feels fragile and threatened. It creates endless seeking, for the self feels incomplete. It produces violence, for the separate self must defend itself against other separate selves. This worldview, which has dominated much of human history and continues to shape the collective consciousness, is not merely false philosophically. It is destructive existentially. It is the root of psychological suffering, the source of the sense of meaninglessness that haunts modern civilization. When existence is understood through the lens of separation, life becomes a desperate scramble for security, pleasure, and significance in a universe indifferent to human concerns. Contrast this with the perception that recognizes one's being as intimately connected to, indeed, as an expression of, the is itself. Here, the ground shifts entirely. There is still the particular expression, the individual consciousness with its unique perspective and history, but it is no longer felt to be fundamentally isolated. Rather, it is known as a wave in the ocean of being, a note in the cosmic symphony, a unique articulation of the one that speaks itself into infinite forms. From this recognition flows a different quality of existence. The anxiety of separation gives way to a fundamental trust, not based on belief but on direct knowing. The restless seeking transforms into a peaceful abiding, not because all questions are answered, but because the questioner has been transformed. The violence of self-protection softens into compassion, for when the boundaries of self are seen through, how can harm be done to what is, in essence, one's own being? The direction of life. This shift in perception is not merely theoretical. It fundamentally alters the direction and quality of life. The worldview that places the divine outside of oneself naturally leads to external activity, to seeking, striving, achieving, accumulating. The spiritual path becomes a project of the ego, a journey of becoming something better, more holy, more enlightened. It generates a future orientation, always reaching for what is not yet attained, always dissatisfied with what is. But the perception that recognizes one's essential nature as not separate from his, directs attention inward, not as a rejection of the external world, but as a discovery of the source from which all manifestation springs. Life becomes less about achieving a distant goal and more about expressing what one already is. The spiritual dimension is not found in some elevated state to be attained, but in the depths of ordinary existence, in the simple fact of being itself. This is not passivity or withdrawal from life. Rather, it is engagement with life from a different center, from the ground of being rather than from the anxious ego. Action continues, but it arises from wholeness rather than from lack, from fullness rather than from need. There is a quality of spontaneity, of naturalness, that characterizes such action, like water flowing downhill, not because it tries to flow but because it is in its nature to flow. The relationship with existence transforms. Where there was grasping, there is allowing. Where there was resistance, there is acceptance. Where there was separation, there is intimacy. The world is no longer experienced as a collection of objects to be used or avoided, but as a sacred manifestation of the is itself, each thing and being a unique expression of the one that underlies all. The foundation of wholeness. From the recognition of one's essential nature, as is flows, a sense of wholeness, of completion that is not dependent on external circumstances. This wholeness is not the achievement of perfection but the recognition that nothing is missing, that nothing needs to be added to the fundamental nature of being. The search ends not in finding something but in the dissolution of the one who was searching. This establishes, from the very beginning, one's true relationship with reality. It is not the relationship of a small, separate self to a vast, indifferent universe. It is not the relationship of a sinner to a distant judge. It is not the relationship of ignorance to knowledge, darkness to light, bondage to freedom. These dualities arise only within the dream of separation. In the awakening to is, they are seen as conceptual overlays upon a reality that is, in itself, undivided. One's destiny is no longer a matter of external fate or divine judgment, but the flowering of what one essentially is. Just as an acorn's destiny is to become an oak, not through effort but through the natural unfolding of its inherent nature, so the human destiny is the realization of the is, that one already is. This is not predestination in the sense of external determination but the recognition that the deepest nature of consciousness is to awaken to itself, to know itself as not separate from the source. Conclusion: the contemplative vision. And so we return, full circle, to where we began, but with vision clarified, with understanding deepened. The questions that drove humanity's spiritual search are not to be answered but transcended, not because they are unimportant but because they arise from a level of consciousness that must itself be transformed. The seeking ends not in finding an object but in the recognition of the subject, that pure awareness, that simple isness that has been present all along, overlooked in its very obviosity. This is the foundation upon which genuine spiritual life must be built. Not upon beliefs or doctrines, however beautifully articulated. Not upon practices or rituals, however ancient and venerable. These may serve as pointers, as reminders, as methods of preparation. But the foundation itself is the direct recognition of one's essential nature, as not separate from the is that is the source and substance of all that exists. From this recognition flows a life of a different quality, contemplative rather than acquisitive, centered in inner stillness rather than dispersed in outer seeking, grounded in being rather than in becoming. It is a life that perceives the sacred not as something exceptional or distant, but as the very fabric of existence itself. Every moment becomes a doorway to the eternal, every experience, a revelation of the is. This is not the end of the journey but its true beginning, the point at which all false starts are recognized as such and the authentic path reveals itself. It is the path that leads nowhere because one is already home, the journey that begins and ends in the same place, the seeking that discovers the seeker and the sought were never two. In the silence of this recognition, in the stillness of this awakening, peace descends, not as an experience among experiences but as the ground of all experience. It is the peace that passes understanding because it is prior to the understanding. It is the wholeness that cannot be broken because it was never divided. It is the is that can never be lost because it is what we, in our deepest nature, are and have always been. Let the seeker rest. Let the questions fall silent. Let consciousness recognize itself in its own mirror. For in that recognition lies the fulfillment of all seeking, the answer to all questions, the end of all exile, and the beginning of true life, the life that knows itself as the is that it has always been.